Hello, everyone. My name is Tom Selby. I'm a senior analyst at AJ Bell. As Roland said, it's my job today to set the scene for the retirement income session, and I'm going to do that by taking a quick look at how coronavirus has impacted various different types of pensions and just run through some of the lessons to be learned for retirement income investors. I think it's fair to say there's been a few of them in the past 12 months. Obviously, this isn't how we normally do these things, and it's disappointing to me, and I'm sure to all the speakers, that we can't be with you in person this year, but hopefully in 12 months' time, we'll be back at one of London's various conference centres. So a quick run through of the stuff I'm going to talk about today. So brief run through of how coronavirus has affected the different types of pensions that you may rely on. So the state pension, defined benefit pensions, which may have withered on the vine in the private sector, but still very much exist as part of people's retirement income plans, particularly those in their 50s and 60s. We'll look at some trends in terms of withdrawing a retirement income, the impact of bad timing, so look at pound cost ravaging, and then some of the investing lessons that could have been learned from coronavirus. As we're talking about accessing your pension, we'll look at some of the tax issues that brings up. And if I have time, I'll run through some saving and retirement investing tips, although if I don't have time, they will be available on my slide deck, which you can all have. You're welcome to. So to kick off, the state pension, it's the foundation on which most people's retirement plans are built. So a quick recap of where we stand. So there are two broad sections to the state pension: there's the old pre-2016 system and the new, in inverted commas, post-April 2016 system. So the basic rate state pension for those who retired before April 2016 set at £134.25 per week. For those who retired post-April 2016, the flat rate state pension set at just over 175 quid. So that's about £9,000 a year. Not enough to enjoy a comfortable retirement for most people, but a solid foundation on which you can build. You won't necessarily receive exactly £175.20 a week under the flat rate state pension, so the amount you receive will depend on your previous record and whether you contracted out under the old system. It will also depend on your national insurance record. So anybody who has a 10-year national insurance record will qualify for some state pension, but it will be a reduced amount. If you've got a 35-year national insurance record, then you'll qualify for the full flat rate state pension. So that's basically how it works. There's a few other complexities I'm not going to go into today. In terms of the impact of coronavirus, well, the state pension not immediately affected, but of course it does rise in line with the triple lock. So that means that the state pension increases by the highest of average earnings, average inflation, or 2.5%. And of course, in a year where inflation's dipped extremely low, as have average earnings, then that 2.5% underpin will kick in and is incredibly valuable to those who receive a retirement income from the state. So that means that the old state pension will increase by £3.35 a week, and the new state pension will rise by £4.40 a week. So that's locked in for April next year. I'd recommend keeping an eye out for the budget whenever it happens in 2021. Clearly, the government's going to be looking to make savings in various different places, and the Office for Budget Responsibility estimated the cost of a triple lock across this entire Parliament to be £6 billion. Now, clearly, that was a manifesto commitment, but whether the government feels it can continue to stick to that manifesto commitment in light of what coronavirus has done to the public finances, of course, remains to be seen. So one to look out for in February, March, when we expect to see that budget being produced by Rishi Sunak. Now, turning to defined benefit schemes, as I mentioned, lots of people will build up not only state pension entitlement, but will also have some entitlement to a DB scheme. If that's you, then you're one of the lucky ones, because they're incredibly generous and have all but died out in the private sector. Now, DB schemes have been on something of a roller coaster ride since, in fact, the great financial crash in 2007 and 2008. They've been caught in something of a pincer movement. So we've seen the Bank of England pursue a quantitative easing program that was deemed necessary to prop up banks and keep the economy afloat post the financial crash. But DB schemes, and in particular DB liabilities, were caught in the crossfire. So as a result of QE, gilt yields plummeted and have stayed low for the past decade or so. And when gilt yields are low, then the accounting value of defined benefit liabilities, so the amount that DB schemes believe they'll have to pay out to the members of those schemes over the course of their retirement, increases. When you couple that with longer term improvements in life expectancy, DB schemes have faced huge funding pressure over the last 10 years, and that pressure has unfortunately increased in 2020. So particularly in the early stages of the pandemic, we saw gilt yields falling, and so the liabilities going up. We also saw asset prices under pressure, both of which led to a significant rise in deficits that schemes were recording. So just to bring some of those numbers to life, so if you look at the top left of the screen here, we have the figures from the Pension Protection Fund, the lifeboat scheme, in place to support members where their sponsor fails, and we'll talk about that a bit in the next slide. This just tracks the accounting level of the liabilities in the light blue line there, and the assets, the dark blue line there, over time. So over the last decade or so, you can see as you go to the top right of that graph, the dark blue line significantly below the light blue line, meaning that you've got pension schemes with deficits and with funding issues that they need to deal with. If you look at the bottom left table now, it's also from the Pension Protection Fund, looking at the factors that are at play here. We can see that asset prices haven't improved significantly for schemes, but it's on the liability side that things have been really difficult. So over the last year, also decreases in gilt yields somewhere between 30 and 40 basis points, pushing up the accounting value of liabilities and increasing the stress on those pension schemes. Now, whenever you see numbers like this, if you're a member of a defined benefit pension scheme, it's quite natural to worry about the future of your pension and whether or not that pension is going to continue to be paid out for as long as you're in retirement. What I always say when I'm talking about this to people is that while the assets and the liabilities are clearly important, the most valuable thing you can have if you're a member of a DB scheme is a strong sponsor. So a strong company there to pay out your pensions over time and to pay off their pension deficits as well over time. As long as that sponsor is strong and has ready cash flow, then you should still be able to get all of the pensions that you're owed. However, clearly coronavirus placed pressure on lots of us, and you can just see the top right there. Topshop Owner Arcadia has recently gone into administration, and that's created some uncertainty for members of that defined benefit pension scheme. But it's important to note that if you have a DB scheme and you're worried about the future, you're worried about the solvency of the employer that's sponsoring it, that if they do go into administration, it's not the end of the world, and you certainly won't lose everything. And that is because the Pension Protection Fund exists. So the PPF is a lifeboat fund set up to ensure that members of defined benefit schemes where the sponsor goes to the wall don't lose everything as a result of that. It provides actually an incredibly generous insurance policy, which you need to consider if you're ever thinking about giving up those retirement benefits. So if you're thinking about transferring out of a DB scheme, for example. So if you've already retired and reached your scheme's normal pension age, that's usually 65, then you should receive 100% compensation for the income that you expected, although you may lose some inflation protection. If you've yet to retire or you took your pension early, then your annual payment will usually be cut by 10%, subject to a cap. When that's all worked through, that cap at 90% will be around £37,000 in 2020-21 for someone who's aged 65. So Clearly, the company sponsoring your DB scheme going into administration is not what you want. However, if you're worried about that happening, or indeed if that has happened, remember that the PPF exists to ensure that you don't lose anything. And in fact, you should get the vast majority of the income that you expected to receive previously. Now, in these circumstances, people are clearly going to be thinking about whether or not they should transfer out of a DB scheme, and that's not something I'm going to go into in detail today. I think that would need an entire presentation on its own, frankly. But just to say that if you have yet to reach a scheme's normal pension age, you can request what's known as a cash equivalent transfer value from that scheme. That just means you can request to be offered a cash sum in return for the guaranteed benefits that you've received. Worth noting here that only members of private sector DB schemes or the local government pension scheme, those are funded types of pension schemes, can request a transfer. If you're a member of an unfunded pension scheme, such as the NHS scheme or teacher scheme, you unfortunately aren't allowed to transfer out of that scheme. For those who are allowed to transfer, if your funds were £30,000 or more, you'll need to take regulated financial advice before doing so, although the requirement is just that you take that advice, not that the advisor says that you do or do not transfer, although it's worth listening to what that advisor tells you if you are considering going down this route, because they have your best interests at heart. Couple of other points: if your DB scheme pension's already in payment, or you won't be able to transfer, so that's something that I have to get asked questions on. And once your scheme enters the PPF assessment period, again, you won't be able to transfer out. So that's the State Pension Foundation and the DB Foundation that some of you will have covered off. Now let's dive into defined contribution pensions, which are of course the pensions that most people will now rely on in their retirement. So automatic enrolments brought a huge swathe of new savers into the pensions market. Around 10 million new people automatically enrolled into workplace pensions. You also have somewhere approaching 1 million people a year investing through SIPs. Clearly, in the early stages of coronavirus, things looked pretty dicey, both for people who were saving for retirement and people who were taking an income retirement as well. So we saw double-digit falls in the value of the FTSE 100, indeed in shares around the world. But of course, the impact of those falls will have depended on the mix of assets that you hold. So if you held lower risk assets or fewer equities, then you're unlikely to have experienced falls to that degree. And also the extent to which you pay into your pension regularly, or if you're putting single lump sums in, perhaps once a year or once every couple of years, that will expose you to more market timing risks. Now, back in April, when I did a webinar for AJ Bell customers, we produced a very similar slide to this, and we reminded people that while things were quite scary in March and April for various reasons beyond, of course, the stock market, for health reasons as well, we reminded people that market volatility is part and parcel of long-term investing. And while things felt incredibly different, and it was something that most of us had never seen before with regards to the pandemic and the lockdown, the movements in markets were very much things that we had seen in decades past and indeed in crises past. And so it's worth, I think, looking just at the impact of pound cost averaging. So that's paying in small amounts each month to smooth out the impact a crisis can have on the money that you're investing. So back in April, when I did a version of this presentation, we looked at the two previous crashes, so the dot-com crash in 2001 and the great financial crash in 2008, and we compared someone who invested £12,000 at the start of that period versus someone who invested £1,000 a month over the course of the year, and saw how pound cost averaging worked to reduce the impact of those falls. So you can see there in a dot-com crash example, with a lump sum invested at the start of the year, over a third drop in the value of that money invested. If it was drip fed over the course of the year, you're talking about an 18% fall, so less than half of that. Great financial crash, very similar. So lump sum invested, 28% fall, half of that figure if you had drip fed the money over time. Bringing that forward to what we've seen in 2020, and it's a very similar story. So at the top left, you have the investor experience of someone who invested £12,000 in the FTSE 100 for this year versus someone who invested £1,000 a month in the FTSE 100. And the result being that if you'd invested at the start of the year with the entire lump sum, you'd have experienced a 14% drop. But if you'd invested £1,000 a month, then you'd have seen a 2% rise. Of course, the caveat here is this means that your highs are going to be less high and your lows are going to be less low. But if you want a smoother process, then drip feeding your investments and benefit from pound cost averaging can be a sensible way to do that. Now, turning to the meat of the presentation, I guess, and the impacts that coronavirus has on people taking a retirement income. And what we're looking at in this slide is how people have responded to what has essentially been the first real significant stock market challenge since the pension freedoms were introduced in 2015. And if you look on the left-hand side here, we have a table which shows the number of individuals taking flexible payments from their pension, so that's taxable payments, and the green in the green bars, and the red line shows the amount of money being taken out by people. Now, the key thing to take away from this slide is if you look at the pattern of that red line in Q2 of each financial year, what we've seen is a spike in the number of withdrawals, and that's what you'd expect because that's the quarter from April when people are taking advantage of a new fresh set of tax allowances. So you can see we have this kind of upwards curving motion right up until Q2 of 2020, which of course was when coronavirus hit, and we saw actually that people took significantly less than they'd taken in Q2 of the previous tax year. Now, you can see the numbers associated with that in the text on the right-hand side here, but the key point to take away from this, I think, is that lots of people who are probably nervous about about accessing their pension when the value of their funds have gone down, who are nervous about what's often referred to as pound cost ravaging, and we'll look at an example of that in a forthcoming slide, were sensible and chose to either stop withdrawing money, reduce their withdrawals, or put off their plans to access their pension for the first time as a result of the falls in stock markets that we saw in the second quarter of the year. So that's good news and suggests that lots of investors, possibly in concert with their advisors, are making sensible decisions to make sure that their drawdown plan remains sustainable, not just now, but throughout their retirement. So I mentioned pound cost ravaging. I think it's worth just running through an example of how this can work. So this is the idea that if you couple large withdrawals in the early stages of retirement with big stock market falls, then if you're in that unlucky position, then a sustainable retirement plan can become an unsustainable one, and you could lose a significant number of years of income as a result. So if we take an example of Paul, 65 years old, who retired in April 2019, post-tax-free cash, he has a fund worth 100 grand. He decides he needs £5,000 a year to support his lifestyle in retirement and wants that increasing by inflation. So £5,000 a year, probably a little bit more than somebody wants to be taking if they want it to be sustainable generally, but people will go down that track sometimes, perhaps if they have other assets in play which they can access once their pension has been spent. So if we compare the two outcomes for Paul, so if after making his initial £5,000 withdrawal, his fund was hit by COVID-19 and he saw a 20% fall, then reducing the value at the end, his fund value would be reduced at the end of the first year to £76,000. If he continues to make withdrawals at the same rate, then his money will run out at his 84th birthday. So that's where in year one he's taken his withdrawal out and then he's been hit by stock markets. If you look at what would have happened if that fall had happened in year 10 of retirement instead, his money runs out at his 87th birthday. So in other words, he gets 3 extra years of retirement income purely because he was lucky enough, in inverted commas, for that stock market fall to happen in the 10th year rather than the first year. So the lesson there for retirement income investors is that if you take big withdrawals at the start and then you face significant falls in the value of your fund as a result of a stock market crash, as we saw this year, then you may need to revisit your plans in order to ensure that they remain sustainable for the future. Now, a quick lesson here on understanding how your money is invested. Now, during the COVID crisis, I had various questions from journalists around this specific point. So there were lots of people who invested in what's known as annuity protector funds. So that's a class of funds listed, which are meant for people who are approaching the point where they're going to turn their pension pot into a guaranteed income for life. Lots of people thought that these funds were invested in relatively safe assets. In fact, they're invested in gilts and largely corporate bonds, and as a result, they fluctuated significantly when the market downturn hit in March and April. And I think the lesson here is to understand what your money is invested in, because for the people who were affected by that big spike downwards that you can see in the middle of the graph there, they were facing the real prospect of having to either retire on significantly less, and some of these funds fell in value by over 10%, so taking a 10% haircut on the value, on the retirement income they were going to get for the rest of their lives, or holding on and hoping for a recovery. Now, luckily there was a recovery, and those people who held on would have been okay, but those people who went early or who went after the initial drop in the value of those funds would have been significantly negatively affected. And the second lesson, of course, one of the big stories of 2020 has been the drying up of dividends. So this is just from this slide is from the HML Q3 dividend dashboard that's produced by the brilliant Russ Mould each quarter of the year. Again, I was asked to comment on various stories this year where investors who hadn't made any plans whatsoever for the possibility that dividends may dry up were now wondering how they were going to make ends meet, wondering how their retirement income plan was going to last. Clearly, dividends often the secret sauce when it comes to delivering a good retirement income. And indeed, if you can follow a natural income strategy where you just live off the dividends, then that's absolutely great. But you need to have a plan B in place where, just in case those dividends don't materialize as you hoped they were going to. And I think that's one of the key lessons that we've learned from the past 12 months. Now, just to quickly run through some of the tax consequences of accessing your pension, because this is really important. So we saw on the previous slide that people have generally reacted in the way that we'd have hoped them to by reducing their withdrawals. However, lots of people will have had to access their pension, perhaps because they were struggling financially, or just perhaps because there were different reasons why they needed to get their money, perhaps to help out a loved one or to pay for long-term care for a relative. Now, the impact of taking taxable income from your pension is that you trigger the money purchase annual allowance. That means that your pension's annual allowance is reduced permanently from £40,000 to just £4,000. So a significant penalty which can be added to, because you also lose the ability to carry forward up to 3 years of previously unused tax allowances from the 3 previous tax years. So taken to the extremists, someone who triggers the MPAA who has relevant UK earnings of £160,000 and can use 3 years of unused allowances from the 3 previous tax years would effectively be reducing their annual allowance for that current tax year by £156,000 by triggering the MPAA by taking taxable income. Another point to highlight is the way that your first flexible withdrawal will be taken. So again, if you're accessing your pension for the first time in this tax year, then HMRC, unfortunately, and this has been the case since the pension freeze were launched in 2015, HMRC will place you on an emergency month 1 tax code, which means that your usual tax allowances are divided by 12 and then applied to that first withdrawal. So if we go back to Paul, who we met in the earlier slides, we consider how this will impact on his initial withdrawal. So if he makes a £12,500 withdrawal in the current tax year, has no other taxable income, he might understandably expect that withdrawal to be taxed at 0% because it's within the personal allowance. However, he hadn't taken into account HMRC's month 1 approach to taxing that withdrawal. And so the result is, when you work through that, actually he faces an initial tax bill of up to £4,000. Now, this has caught lots of people out, confused lots of people, many of whom have no idea that this is the way that HMRC approaches it, or what they need to do in order to get the money back. So the good news is that there are ways to get the money back. You should be able to get a refund within 30 days, provided you fill out one of the 3 forms listed at the bottom of this slide. Different form depending on how you've accessed your retirement pot. However, if you don't do that, then you'll be relying on the efficiency of HMRC to sort out your tax affairs, which of course is never ideal. One final point, so if you're accessing your pension for the first time, lots of people will do that mainly with the motivation of getting their 25% tax-free cash, and that's understandable. The 25% tax-free cash is one of the better reasons to save in a pension, one of the bigger perks from retirement saving. Although accessing your tax-free cash won't necessarily mean a change in your underlying investments or your priorities, it's worth taking it as an opportunity to review your retirement plans and your ultimate goals. So, for example, someone planning to take a regular income after accessing their tax-free cash will likely have a very different asset allocation to someone who doesn't plan to touch the money for the remaining 15 years. So it's worth, if you're taking your 25% tax-free cash, just have a look at the way your money is allocated, think about your priorities, think about what you want to do with the rest of that money before going on plowing on regardless. One of the key concerns that the Financial Conduct Authority, the regulator of the city, has raised is around people investing in cash over the long term. So people moving into drawdown and having the rest of their pot allocated too much to cash for 10, 15, 20 years and seeing the value of their pot eaten away. So that's something to consider, alongside the fact that, of course, when you invest in the stock market, your investments can go down as well as up, particularly over the short term. Now, I've got a few tips here for and lessons to consider if you're saving for retirement. However, I am conscious of time. I suspect if we were in the conference hall at the moment, I will be getting the eyes from Lisa to say it's time to finish the presentation, which is absolutely fair enough. So a few tips there which you can take away from you if you're saving retirement. A few at the end there as well, if you're taking an income in retirement, which is obviously the key thing for these sessions this afternoon. Mostly things that I've covered off already. One point that I'll make there, just from the final highlighted bullet point in there, in terms of making sure you have a plan B, is to consider the tax treatment of your pension when you're thinking of passing it on to a loved one. So pensions now benefit from incredibly generous tax treatment on death. So if you die before age 75, then those who you want to pass your money on to can access the money tax-free. If you die after 75, then it will be taxed at their marginal rate of income tax when they come to make a withdrawal. So when you're prioritising your withdrawals and prioritising the assets that you want to access, if one of your priorities is to pass on money to loved ones, and think about whether or not you want the pension to be the first thing you access, or something that you access later, because any money that's left untouched in a pension will receive incredibly generous tax treatment on death. And that's it from me, the usual disclaimers there.